17 years. I know you had to wait a bit, but after 17 years, Atom Egoyan is with us again. We are very happy for this evening. We are very happy for the retrospective and for the soirée and the masterclass yesterday, thanks to the collaboration with Posar. As all directors should do, I shut up and I leave the floor to Atom Egoyan, interviewé par William Fair.
I was watching your very first feature, Next of Kin, a few days ago, because I have to introduce it in 2 days from now, and it was really fascinating to see. Of course, Next of Kin and The Captive are very different in many ways, but also they are both thematically and for some, even aesthetic things, they have so much in common. Themes like the family, memory, things not being what they seem, trouble in communicating, figures, like screens on which people are watching people that don't know they are watched. There are a lot of common elements. So, could you reflect on those things that you are carrying with you and are still here in your cinema, but in a different way, but still faithful to what was your very first move into filmmaking?
Well, it's interesting. I wouldn't have thought of that link, but the moment you started speaking about it, I remembered how excited I was when my friend who was working in this therapy clinic, and the therapy clinic involved this room that you see in the first feature. You'll see this room with cameras, and you'll see my friend Tino. The camera goes wide and you'll see him operating the cameras, and that was his job. It was to work in this therapy clinic, family therapy clinic, where at the time it was a technique where the therapist would invite the family in, get them to talk about their issues, and then members of the family would go and look at the tape later on individually and see how they were behaving and talk about their behavior with the therapist. I think it's become obsolete, but it was a particular therapist whose name was Salvador Minuchin, and he had written a book, and it was quite popular. And there was a book I have from the early 80s called Video Techniques in Family Therapy. Mm-hmm. But what was astonishing to me was that one day I was walking with my friend Tino, and he said, "Oh, that's..." And then he stopped himself because he realized it was someone he knew from the therapy clinic who didn't know that, of course, and it would be a violation to say that he knew this person, but he felt that there was this intimacy. And I found that really disturbing, but also provocative. But this was a different time in the 80s. Video was just becoming available at a consumer level, and the idea of having this way of looking at our own families was very early. So that the film I made, I was saying, essentially family viewing. 2 years later, there's a boy, 18-year-old boy, who finds videotapes of himself with his mother as a child, and these videotapes are in color and they're sound. And in 86 or 86 when we shot it, this was impossible, that an 18-year-old character would be looking at himself as a child of 10 years later. Well, in 66 there was no color home video. But now it's become obviously very common. And then it leads to this film, Captive, where you have a pedophile ring. We're not quite sure exactly what the nature of it is, except they seem to be trading images of the parents who are left behind. Like, not so much the children, maybe, but the victims that have been left as the children have been abducted. So this idea of trying to create this whole different audience, which is somehow linked to the technology that makes this type of perversion or this type of impulse possible. So in the therapy room, It was this impulse to watch other people or to watch ourselves interacting with our loved ones, our fathers or our mothers. So the technology made that possible, but it also deformed behavior, I think. That's probably why this therapy didn't work, because people at a certain point are aware that they are performing, that there's a performative aspect when there's a camera. And I think you're seeing that in this film as well. You'll see a very difference in style between the naturalistic acting and then the heightened acting of the people who are living in a more performative world. And this is the natural outcome of being watched, of knowing you're being watched. And now as a society, we're all being watched. So there's a performative aspect in all of our behavior. We've been deformed by that. In the 80s, I think there was still a naivete. It was still, there were films like David Holtzman's Diary. I remember this documentary. And there were, some films that were dealing with this idea of how filming could transform us, but it wasn't really understood as it is.
And maybe in specific terms, what was the starting point of The Captive?
Well, The Captive was a script I started many years ago, and then I stopped because it was really too dark, but because it was based on this real story that happened. I mean, of course you're aware of this here in this country as well, but in Ontario there was a small town called Cornwall, and there was a group of young men who were coming up with the same story, that all of the elders of this town, the judges, the politicians, lawyers, teachers, priests, were involved in this pedophile ring. And it was kind of unbelievable that all of these people could be involved, but these people were all saying the same story, where it was happening, how they were dressed, what the rituals were. And the largest public investigation in Ontario's history went into investigating this, $50 million, 3 years. And at the end of it, all the judge could say was they couldn't be sure. And there was left at that. And there was one detective, one officer, who completely was with the victims and said, this is not adequate, we have to go further. And this person was completely ostracized, like crazy. Like he's now not working with the police, and he's living like a hermit on the west coast of the country because he still believes this was real. But that was such a disturbing story, and I started writing about this, and I found that I was blocked at a certain point because, and then a friend of mine, basically, who has watched all my films, said, you always are about to go into a more commercial genre thriller mode, and why don't you try it this time? Why don't you bring in more of the kind of genre expectation? And I basically gave him my script, and I said, okay, listen, you've been saying this for years, show me, what do you mean? So he came back with a draft where you'll see, and there's a whole, the whole interior life of these detectives, and the more procedural element is what my friend brought to this story. So my original script was really about the parents and about the abductor and the child, and then it developed into this other world of the people who work in these child units, the special investigation unit, it's called, dealing with these types of victims. And also doing the research, it was very troubling because you realize that these are detectives who are trying to break pedophile rings, pretending to be pedophiles. But the one thing that they cannot do by law is use children. So it raises a question of, well, how effective are they? I mean, these rings are so sophisticated. So if you're not coming with a child, how are you actually making yourself believable? And the detectives never answer this question. I mean, and I think it's because we know that they use digital images that are already existing, and they can modify those. And now there's dolls that are available. Very, I don't know if you've seen these images, the very lifelike dolls that might be used. But it really does raise the question of, well, how can you begin to understand it if you can't be believed? and you'll see the consequences of that in this film as well. It's a troubling world, but I guess maybe again in this country you're probably more hardened to it because it's so you've had some horrifying cases, obviously, and also it's interesting that you're not seeing any of that in the film. It's all sort of referred to, but it's very present in the mood of the film.
Your ways of filming a genre movie are quite different from the mainstream way. I mean, you're showing an abduction by not showing it,
Yeah.
and even when things very violent happen, like in Devil Not also, there is always this very quiet, way of pacing the movie, and the camera moves.
Well, I suppose it's just a way of creating tension for me. I mean, I think yes, in genre, traditional filmmaking, you either withhold or you reveal in a way that's very different from what I'm doing. In this film, in some ways, it can't be a thriller because we know that she's alive. I mean, from the beginning, it's the first frame. You see that the girl who is abducted is alive and is living quite comfortably in this beautifully designed house. So the tension is not about anticipating the classic elements. There's no ticking clock. Most abduction thrillers are based on the fact that we have to find her as quickly as possible. Every moment counts. Well, this has been 8 years, so every moment doesn't count. Matter of fact, it's the opposite. It's really about people living with this for 8 years and the psychological details of what that means or doesn't mean. And so it doesn't have that conventional motor that a thriller would normally have. And in terms of seeing violence, I think that by withholding it, it creates a mystery. Well, in Devil's Knot it had to be, because we don't know what happened. I mean, that to me is an incredible story, because basically 3 young boys in Arkansas are found naked, bound, mutilated in a swamp in the southern states, and there's no evidence at the crime scene. There was no footprints, no blood, no branches were disturbed, no DNA, nothing. It was supernatural. So to show what actually happened would be very presumptuous. And I understand that many people with that film were waiting for an answer, but what a great opportunity to explore something where there really is no answer, and to even introduce other elements of evidence that were not brought in. So actually, it's my fascination is to create maybe an anticipation, or the imagination is ignited. But most of all, I'm trying to find in all the films a language which represents what the characters are feeling, how they would actually imagine themselves. So this is what maybe creates this odd feeling sometimes, with this film especially, where there's something about the tone of the performance or the way it's shown that doesn't feel correct, but it's because I'm trying to show how that character would see themselves. It's not looking at it objectively, and the exciting thing about cinema for me is that we can do that. We can enter into that place, and most genre films really don't do that. They follow, from the viewer's point of view, that there's a set of expectations, and there's certainly, and maybe the frustration of this film, there's a certain expectation of how things might be revealed, but it really is withholding that, because I'm trying to show also that however horrible that moment was, 8 years later, it cannot be in that horrible moment, all the time. Mm-hmm. That there has to be something maybe even banal and everyday about it, which is what begins to create this other process that we see of watching the parents. Mm-hmm. I think as you watch this film, that we get hints that Cassandra, the girl who was abducted, wanted to see the parent, wanted to have contact with the parents. And I think that this device that the abductor creates was actually done as a gift to her originally, to allow her to have access to seeing her parents. The mother works as a maid, and if you watch speaking parts, I guess, you'll see that this idea of video cameras in hotel rooms was explored in the 80s, which is odd. But then the moment he sees that there's this channel that he's created, he begins to understand how he can use it for his own thrill, his own way of sharing with these other people.
So could you tell us a little about the role of music in your films and how you work with it?
Yeah, I mean, I've been very lucky. I've been working with the same composer since these early films, Michael Dana, who you would know because he won the Academy Award for Life of Pi. And he does all these bigger films now, but we still work together, and his work on this film and also on the next film, Remember, that we're doing right now, he's doing a really great track for this film as well. And I'm just really fortunate that we have this language, and I'm able to shoot thinking about his music and thinking about where there will be music and where there's space for music, and the type of music it will be. In the early films we were very lucky because we didn't have to do a temp score. We didn't have to show it to audiences before, and that gave us an incredible privilege. And now, because of the way films are made, there's a temp score, and I always make sure not to use his music when I'm doing the temp score, because I want him to come up with something original. But it's a very, his process has changed a lot since he started working with Hollywood, because when they do the temp score on a Hollywood film, that's the type of music they want. But I really encourage in my work with Michael that we try very different things. And so this is a very unusual score, I think. It's quite aggressive at parts, and also the original title was Queen of the Night, so there's this distorted Mozart sort of theme that comes up quite specifically as well, and it was really interesting to work on this sound. It's sort of I also work with a sound designer, and I've been working with him as long as I've been working with Michael, Stephen Monroe, and we really do think about the soundtrack, and Daniel Pellerin, who has mixed all the films. It's really a trio that we've been working together for 30 years, and the sound design is really important. And it's really fantastic that as the technology has allowed us to now work in the new film, it's in 7:1, this is still 5:1 I think, but you can detail things in a really quite remarkable way.
I mean, you were one of the few directors of that time really being busy redefining what filming was. I mean, with very experimental, very strong, very recognizable way of doing things. I remember moments when going out a theater where a film by another director we will say, well, very Egoyan. Right. So it was how consciously, how conscious were you of that happening, and then I mean, when did you maybe become aware that it could either be something very good, and also maybe something limiting?
Well, definitely last year with this film it felt like very limiting, because the film, as you probably know, was in Cannes in competition, and it was like a crazily aggressive response. And I think it's probably because people saw those trademarks, but they were seeing it maybe in a genre way, and I can't explain exactly what happened, but it was very toxic, and it made me think a lot about this issue. But honestly, I remember when we did Exotica and people were talking about the non-linear narrative and how unusual it was, and I never thought it was that unusual, because I remember seeing the films of Alain Resnais, and I remember seeing Muriel, or I remember seeing last year at Marienbad, and I remember. And when people talk about the Goyan feeling, I just think about, well, the feeling comes from Hitchcock, and it comes from these filmmakers that I have really adored, and it's an amalgamation of all those things. Maybe it's an amalgamation of that tradition of from Michael Powell and Hitchcock to then you know, the Antonioni and of course Bergman and of course, you know, Bresson and of course Buñuel and, you know, like all of these filmmakers that I really was intoxicated by. I love these films so much. So when I started telling these stories, I understand that the stories are different. Like the narrative of the proposal of these early films is different from these filmmakers. But the feeling or the sense of what the camera is doing, I was always drawn to these filmmakers. I respected this other tradition, which you now see so incredibly well exploited in this country with the Dardennes and Mike Loach, Ken Loach, and this direct cinema. But the problem was, as a Canadian, I was raised with this. The National Film Board, these films that we saw in school, it was always docudrama. It was always, and I just became so, I reacted against this, and it was almost something that I was very much resisting. So I do think that there are these filmmakers that I began to see in the 80s that were doing more theatrical and more self-conscious work, and I was feeling that that was really quite amazing. Tarkovsky, of course, Greenaway, you know, these were at that time filmmakers that were really exciting. So, you know, I'm a product of all these influences, I think. But on top of it, I also come from theater. Maybe that's important to understand that before I was making films, I was writing plays. I still do theater. I still do opera. And when you talk about music, you know, it's something that I feel very comfortable in joining drama and music. I just did a production of De Valkyrie, and it was so amazing to be involved in this type of music drama. Salome, you know, the Strauss opera. These are amazing texts and amazing composers who are setting the drama to music. Even like original operas that I did a Chinese opera a couple of years ago by Gao Wenjing. Gavin Bryars did his opera for English National Opera. So I feel that this is an amazing opportunity, and the idea of a film without music, I respect it a lot. I just think it's amazing when I see the Darden films, because they're really observational, and it's so true, but it's a different tradition. It's almost like a different type of cinema.
Do you remember maybe one or two specific experience with films that maybe were at starting something, I mean, inside you, maybe not only artistically but emotionally, and that made their way into your own?
Well, I remember a very important moment with my grandmother. When we came to Canada, I didn't speak English, and I would be with her, and we'd go and walk around the city on the west coast of Canada, and she took me to a film once. It was, I think it was The Sandpipers, and there was a scene where a person was crushed by a piston in a ship, and I remember like watching this and just being horrified, and her covering my eye. I remember that physical moment really well, and just sort of like seeing something that was so horrifying and so visceral, and being shielded from it. So, but creatively, artistically, I guess it had to be Bergman, right? You know, because you know, when you're an adolescent at that time and you wanted you know, any sort of sex you could find, you would watch on the French station on CBC, they'd be showing European art films, and that actually was why I started watching European art films, but to be perfectly honest. And it was this moment in The Silence. I saw The Silence on television, and it was so powerful, this moment in the cinema where there's this couple making love and other people watching, and it was just crazy. I couldn't believe I was watching something so overwhelming. So, but what was overwhelming was the sight of where this was happening as well. It was in a cinema, and I remember that just felt so powerful. And then I think there were these great, you know, like Canadian films as well, coming from Quebec, like Mon Oncle Antoine, which is really, I think it was just voted one of the best Canadian films on some international poll, and also there was films like this whole tradition, which I'm sure is forgotten, but like Jean-Pierre Lefebvre making these very artisanal films, like very small films, and that was very inspiring as well.
Okay, things might look as they are, as they really are,
Right.
except there is always something else
Yeah.
happening at the same time.
Well, we're watching. That's what's happening. So like we're observing that moment, and I just think that that's such an important thing to address. Like it's so, but I understand that there are people who hate that feeling of being self-conscious when they're watching, and I think that it's also something that can be experienced in a cinema. It's difficult to get that on a television. In a way, it's become a cliche on television, kind of this mock-drama type effect where there's a camera crew that's watching, and there's the characters look at the camera occasionally. It's become a cliche. It started here in Belgium, obviously with what's the French title? It's Man Bites Dog in English, but yeah. But that became like such a tired tradition. But there's a crew, and that's not really that becomes almost a formula. But this idea of really addressing the viewer's anticipation and fear. And this film has been really interesting for me, and I almost wish we could have this conversation after, because some people get very affected by this, like really affected, and then other people just will dismiss it, and I'm not quite sure. I think it's just a sensibility, and I've come to the conclusion that there are filmmakers who understand a large audience, a mass audience, and I never really will be that filmmaker. Like there's a very specific conversation I want to have, and it's really so precise. The film we're finishing right now called Remember, and it'll be ready in the fall, and I'm very excited about it because it allowed me to go back to a style I haven't used before, which it's funny, we were talking about direct cinema, but it is handheld. I used handheld in Next of Kin, and then I stopped it. But this was such an interesting script. It wasn't my own script. It's about a Holocaust survivor who has early stages dementia, and he thinks he's found the person responsible for killing his family at Auschwitz, and he goes on a mission to track this person down and kill him, but he keeps forgetting why. He keeps forgetting why he has a gun. He keeps forgetting like why he's on this in the middle of the country, and so it's sort of this meditation on trauma and memory, and it's all these themes that are so close to me. But it was written in a completely linear way, and when the moment I read it, I remembered working with Christopher Plummer in Ararat, and I just thought this would be a great role for him, and so he's in it, and I'm pretty excited. You'll see it in the fall.